2, 3, start.
Hi, I'm Ashwin Desai, and this is the city of Durban. I've lived in the city all my life, and when we heard that COP17 was coming to Durban, it was some kind of excitement. Excitement in the sense that we have followed all these negotiations on the global terrain, and suddenly it was going to be on our doorstep. But we wanted to kind of think about two things when we heard this. We wanted to have people have a sense of the city, the contestations that were taking place between a sort of post-apartheid city with the city authorities wanting to have these mega projects, a neoliberal city that was excluding as much as was including, but also had a sense of the global debates as they come to bear on the local.
Well, you know, our book is half about Durban, where Ashwin is the best writer the city's ever had, really pulling together evocative sensibilities from central Durban, South Durban, and at the global scale, we also find ourselves in the center of the world for the COP17. We just call it the Conference of Polluters for reasons that should be clear. That COP17 occurs in the International Convention Center in central Durban, not far from the beach. Lots of activities are going to be happening there, and here at the University of KwaZulu-Natal are people spaces. And we know from 9 years back what these conferences are all about. The World Summit on Sustainable Development, Rio Plus 10, was in Johannesburg in 2002, and we learned about the privatization agenda. We had 30,000 people marching against water commodification. And that was the beginning of us realizing the privatization of the air was on the agenda, because corporations had taken over the agenda of the United Nations, using big countries, the US in particular, as their vehicles to hijack the UN, most explicitly when it comes to fossil fuel addiction. And these guys are not going to get off the addiction. They're here in Durban to keep the addiction and not to save the planet. We know that from Copenhagen 2 years ago. The Copenhagen Accord had these 5 guys: Jacob Zuma, the president of South Africa, Lula of Brazil, Barack Obama of the US, Wen Jiabao of China, and Manmohan Singh of India, breaking the United Nations, as Bill McKibben put it, because they cut a deal, the Copenhagen Accord, that will lead to 4-degree increase in temperature. Just unmanageable for our species and many, many others. And also is non-binding, so it was no deal at all. And it was a real situation of hot air in Copenhagen, and then the following year, big business got back into the act to try to get the carbon markets up and running. They've been flat, corruption-ridden, fraud-ridden. And in the Copenhagen Accord, they are going to be emphasized, and Durban will be a point, just like in 2001, the World Conference Against Racism, where the United States puts its own for-profit agenda, no emissions cuts agenda, back at center point. We saw in September 2001 the US making a farce of a conference that should have demanded reparations for slavery, colonialism, apartheid, as well as Zionism as racism, and the US just refused to play ball. Partly because of people like this. The chief negotiator, Todd Stern, one of the key enemies of the planet and of the people, he was asked about reparations for the climate damage caused. He said, that sense of guilt or culpability or reparations, I just categorically reject that. And we know from WikiLeaks, thank goodness for Julian Assange, for Bradley Manning accused of leaking 500,000 US State Department documents, that the bullying of countries like Ethiopia, whose president Meles Zenawi did a U-turn on climate debt, or the Maldives, whose cabinet met in scuba gear to dramatize the sinking of their island. And for $50 million, Todd Stern's people bribed and bullied and blackmailed them into supporting the Copenhagen Accord, which is certain death for their people. Partly we're worried because our own foreign minister, Maite Nkoana Mashabane, has given again and again our foreign policy to enemy nations. For example, Beijing, where we couldn't even get the Dalai Lama a visa because Beijing didn't want him to attend Archbishop Desmond Tutu's 80th birthday in October. And so we've got a big problem with the negotiators. The key financier, this man, Robert Zoellick, the president of the World Bank, has a kind of record that would make you blush. What is he doing in Durban when he, at the World Bank, increased the loans, including to South Africa, for a coal-fired power plant dramatically in his tenure? When he's pushing commodity exports, when he's pushing resource curse financing, when he's promoting carbon trading, which is the privatization of the air instead of solving the problem. A man like Robert Zoellick after Paul Wolfowitz was fired for nepotism in 2007, comes to the World Bank as its president from Goldman Sachs, the most destructive bank in the world, where he was a top international financier. Before that, US State Department. He was number 2 in the Bush regime. Terrible imperialist project. Then he was the US trade rep before that for the World Trade Organization, where he destroyed the WTO by all accounts. Before that, he was in charge of vote counting in Florida when George W. Bush had that election stolen from Al Gore in 2000. Before that, he was a senior political advisor to Enron. Before that, a Project for New American Century co-founder, an original neocon. Before that, number 2 at Fannie Mae, the institution that supported the subprime mortgages, which helped wreck the world economy in 2008. Before that, an advisor to George Bush Sr. and an official during the savings and loan crisis. Everything the man touches, he breaks. These are the kinds of people in scraping the bottom of the barrel that the world negotiators have come up with. And just to remind, their vision is the market solves the problem caused by the market. And carbon trading at this site, the biggest landfill in Africa, here in central Durban at Clare Estate, is their guinea pig. And it's a project put into a black area, the largest landfill, because the old apartheid Durban government didn't care that black people lived there. Instead of closing it, the World Bank came along and said, don't close it, leave the dump there, fill it up, pull the methane out, turn to electricity. And that's what we get in this huge landfill, a flaring of methane. It's not even very effective, which keeps a racist dump open. It's a real emblem of enclosure that comes with carbon trading, and it's a way we go back to Durban, Ashwin, and say the problems of climate are epitomized in some of the things we see here, like in South Durban.
Well, I mean, that's what we have been good at, in a sense, that when we had WACA, when we had WSSD, is to take those global issues, global discussions, but power them by raising local issues, embarrassing the local ruling classes, exposing the contradictions of a so-called developmental model. And nothing exposes that more than the South Basin. On the one hand, there are slit-eyed bats that have been battle wind turbines, but just below in the valley, there's a struggle every day where kids, just recently, 100 kids were taken to hospital, engine fire, they swallowed poison, and the community mobilizes. It's normal for kids in that area, alongside their lunch, to pack asthma pumps. But at the same time, incredible forms of mobilization and contestations.
In fact, I think South Durban, where I live, epitomizes what's wrong with fossil fuel addiction. Here we've got the largest petrochemical complex in all of Africa. When you put the refineries together with the auto plant, the paper mill, huge petrochemical plants that spew toxins into the air in residential areas. We're building a new port on top of Africa's largest port. We've got huge container terminals, freight traffic. This is an absolute armpit of Africa, where the people are really suffering, the people who live in places like Clarewood and Wentworth and Merebank, right next to these toxic facilities. Another place not far away is Cato Manor.
Well, Cato Manor is an area full with history. It's a place that African people try to carve out for themselves in a city that sought to push them to the boundaries of the city and just be there as a reservoir for labor. And there have been incredible forms of resistance, especially the 1959 Beer Hall riots. So if you want to visit Durban, you want to understand its history and its contemporary forms of development, you've got to go to Cato Manor, because here you would have RDP houses contesting with shacks that are overflowing. You've got solar heating, and you've got something called the biodigester, which I found, much to my surprise. And the way to really understand this place is to go along with Thando Manzi, a young student from University of KwaZulu-Natal, who lives in the place, and he'll tell you much more than I can about the ship tank called the biodigester and other stories.
The fish tank. Okay, well, in Cato Manor, there's a lot of activities taking place just prior to the COP17, which is very unusual or funny that just prior to the COP17, now we're getting solar geysers, and there was supposed to be implementation of the biodigester, which didn't happen due to the community resisting towards it. But then what's been happening right now, we've been getting some solar geysers facing in all directions, which is very funny, because in the southern hemisphere, solar geysers should be facing north to receive maximum sunlight. And as you're going to be taking a tour in Ketamani, you'll be viewing a lot of different activities happening and how the community is viewing all of this. Because at the moment, a lot of families are resisting this and are taking other forms of fuels for cooking, such as fossil fuels, etc., burning a fire to cook.
Well, one of the reasons for those local stories is that on the one hand we wanted people who come from international arenas to have a sense of the city, to have a sense of its contradictions, to have a sense of its contestations. At the same time, one wanted, and to the emphasis on the global, local people to understand these are issues and debates that are taking place across the world. So in a sense, it's an invitation for local people to become part of global debates and for global activists to really have a sense of the local. And an invitation, in many senses, to go to Cato Manor, follow Thando Manzi, and go to the Salt Basin, where asthma rates are 4 or 5 times the national average. So visit Cato Manor in the Salt Basin. Just don't breathe too heavily.
And don't breathe too heavily if you're inside the negotiations, because what we understand is that this is all about increasing the space of emissions by national delegations on behalf of their big business blocks, especially fossil fuels. The best cartoonist in the world is South African, Zapiro. As he shows here, really these COP17s, after 16 efforts, right, to try to address climate change, they're no closer. And we're looking at a disaster for the planet and for society. And indeed, our book shows again and again that this is an incredible gamble for the United Nations, for the World Bank, for these governments, for their allied corporations to come to Durban. They're gambling, as we try and show in the book, that Durban will be hospitable. But we're going to have some protesters out on the streets. But just as importantly, they're gambling that they can still scam the world to think that market solutions are appropriate for this market problem. And our book shows that that won't work. We instead need climate justice. Thank you. Read the book.
Thank you. Great. Fantastic. See you at the